Australia is marketed as one of the world's safest, happiest, and most diverse countries. But for Black expats and Black immigrants, the lived experience doesn't always match the brochure. Today on Virtual Travel by Brian, we're breaking down the real pros and cons of living in Australia as a Black person, based on data, expat testimony, and global race patterns. From the outside, Black people in Australia are told they're stepping into a racial paradise, yet stories across the Australian Black community raise uncomfortable questions about Australia's racism experience, workplace bias, and social belonging. For anyone leaving the United States or researching moving to Australia, this isn't hype, it's reality. Stay with me as we uncover what life in Australia for Black people really looks like, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Let's start with the biggest pros of living in Australia as a Black person. Number 1. High standard of living. Let's get something out of the way. When it comes to quality of life, Australia is not playing games. This is one of the few countries on Earth where the basics of living still feel basic. Clean streets, working public transport, drinkable tap water, and hospitals that don't ask for your credit score before they save your life. For many Black Americans who are tired of choosing between rent and a doctor's visit, that alone feels revolutionary. Australia's universal healthcare system, Medicare, means most doctor visits, emergency care, and hospital stays are either free or heavily subsidized. A Black American living in Melbourne put it bluntly, "I went to the ER, got an X-ray, saw a doctor, and walked out without pulling out my wallet. I almost cried." In the United States, that same visit could easily turn into a $3,000 bill and a year of phone calls from debt collectors. That difference changes how safe you feel just walking around in your own body. Then there's the work culture. Australians work to live, not live to work. Paid vacation, sick leave, and parental leave aren't perks, they're standard. A Black software engineer in Sydney told an expat forum, "My boss literally told me to go home and stop checking emails. In America, I'd get praised for burnout. Here, they think it's unhealthy." For people who grew up grinding just to survive, that kind of balance feels unreal. And let's talk about safety. Australia has far lower violent crime rates than the US, and especially lower gun violence. According to global safety rankings, Australia consistently places among the safest countries for residents, and that includes Black people. You can walk at night in many neighborhoods without that tight feeling in your chest. A Black woman living in Brisbane said, "I still keep my awareness, but I don't feel hunted here the way I did back home." That psychological shift is priceless. The cities are clean, the air is cleaner. Public spaces are actually maintained. Parks look like parks, not abandoned movie sets. Even the beaches are public, which sounds small until you realize in some countries, access to beauty is locked behind money. None of this means Australia is perfect. But when it comes to standard of living, healthcare, safety, worker protections, and daily quality of life, Australia gives Black expats something the US often doesn't: room to breathe. And sometimes, breathing is the first step toward healing. Number 2. Strong economy and job demand. One thing Australia does not play about is labor. This country is short on workers in all the places that actually keep a modern society running: healthcare, engineering, construction trades, IT, logistics, and infrastructure. In other words, if you have a real skill and not just a flashy resume, Australia is interested. Very interested. Australia's immigration system is built around what they call a skills shortage list. Nurses, electricians, plumbers, software developers, civil engineers, truck drivers, and healthcare aides are all on it. That means when you apply, the first thing they look at isn't your race or your accent, it's whether they need what you can do. A Black mechanical engineer who relocated to Perth said it best, "Back home, I was always the diversity hire. Here, I'm just the guy who knows how to fix things." That alone changes how you walk into a workplace. Wages are another shock to the system. Australia's minimum wage is one of the highest in the world, and skilled workers earn significantly more. A registered nurse in Sydney told an expat group, "I make almost double what I made in Florida, and I work fewer hours." For Black immigrants in Australia, that kind of math is life-changing. It means you're not trapped in survival mode. You can actually save, invest, and plan. And it's not just white-collar jobs. Trades are respected here. Electricians, plumbers, carpenters, and heavy equipment operators are treated like professionals because they are. A Jamaican-born electrician in Melbourne said, "In the US, I was scraping by. Here I bought a house in 5 years." That's not hustle culture. That's a functioning economy. Now, does racism disappear when you get a paycheck? Of course not. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Money cushions reality. When you are in demand, you have leverage. When employers need you, you don't have to beg. And in Australia's tight labor market, skilled black workers often have more negotiating power than they ever did back home. This is why so many black expats in Australia quietly say the same thing: "I finally feel like my work is valued." That doesn't mean every door opens easily, but more of them open than you might expect. In a world where black talent is often undervalued, Australia's worker shortage creates something rare. A system that, at least on paper, rewards what you know instead of who you are. And sometimes that's enough to change a life. Number 3. Low police violence compared to the US. For many black Americans, just hearing the word police can tighten the chest a little. That reflex didn't come from nowhere. In the United States, policing has a long history of being aggressive, militarized, and, far too often, deadly. Australia is not free of racial bias, but it operates on a very different scale when it comes to how encounters with law enforcement usually end. The numbers matter here. The US records hundreds of police-involved killings every year. Australia, by contrast, averages only a handful of fatal police shootings annually across the entire country. That doesn't mean no one is harmed. It means deadly force is far less normalized. A black American who moved to Sydney said in an interview, "I still get nervous when I see cops, but I don't feel like my life is on the line every time." That psychological shift is huge. In Australia, police are not walking around with the same hair-trigger culture. Most officers don't carry guns at all times, and those who do operate under much stricter rules. A black British resident in Melbourne explained, "I've been stopped here. It wasn't fun, but I walked away from it." That's a low bar. But for people who grew up watching viral videos of routine traffic stops turning fatal, it's a meaningful one. This doesn't mean black and indigenous people aren't targeted more often. They are. Studies consistently show they're more likely to be stopped, questioned, or searched. An Ethiopian-Australian man shared online, "They see me, they notice me, but they don't escalate it the way I saw back home." That difference between being noticed and being endangered is everything. There's also no culture of officers acting like an occupying army. You don't see armored vehicles rolling through neighborhoods or officers treating civilians like combatants. A black woman in Brisbane said, "I don't love the police here, but I don't fear them." That's a subtle but powerful distinction. For black expats, this creates a rare feeling. You might still deal with bias, but you're less likely to become a hashtag. You're less likely to end up on the evening news because of a misunderstanding, a bad mood, or a wrong move. Australia is not a racial utopia, but when it comes to policing, it offers something many black people have never experienced: a system that, most of the time, doesn't treat everyday life like a battlefield. And sometimes that sense of physical safety is the foundation everything else is built on. Number 4. Multicultural cities exist. One of the biggest lies people believe about Australia is that black people are rare. They're not. They're just not marketed. Tourism ads show surfers, blonde kids on the beach, and smiling couples at cafes, but they don't show the Nigerian grocery store in Western Sydney, the Ethiopian coffee shops in Melbourne, or the Caribbean food trucks popping up in Brisbane on weekends. Yet that world is very real. Sydney alone is home to tens of thousands of people with African and Caribbean roots. Suburbs like Blacktown, Mount Druitt, and parts of Western Sydney have some of the largest African communities in the country. Melbourne's western suburbs are known for their Ethiopian, Sudanese, and Somali populations, with churches, markets, and cultural centers that feel more like a piece of East Africa than a postcard from Australia. A South Sudanese resident in Melbourne said, "People think we're invisible here. We're not. We're just not in the tourist photos." And it's not just about where people live, it's about what they've built. Black churches are a huge part of the Australia Black community. They're not only places of worship, but social hubs, job networks, and cultural anchors. A Jamaican-born pastor in Sydney once joked, "If you want to find black people in Australia, follow the gospel music." He wasn't wrong. Food is another giveaway. Afro and Caribbean cuisine has quietly exploded in Australian cities. You can find jollof rice, injera, oxtail, plantain and jerk chicken across major metro areas. One black American living in Perth said, "The first time I had Ethiopian food here, I realized I wasn't as far from home as I thought." That kind of familiarity matters when you're thousands of miles away from your roots. Cultural festivals also bring the community together. Events like Africa Day, Caribbean carnivals, and Afrobeat festivals draw huge crowds every year. They're loud, colorful, and unapologetically black, even if they don't make it into national tourism campaigns. So yes, the Australia black community exists. It's just layered under the surface. You won't always see it in glossy ads or on postcards, but if you know where to look, it's alive, organized, and growing. And for black expats and black immigrants, finding those spaces often makes the difference between simply living in Australia and actually feeling like you belong. Number 5. Global passport power. One of the quiet superpowers of living in Australia has nothing to do with beaches, accents, or kangaroos. It's the passport. Australia's passport is ranked among the strongest in the world, giving visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to more than 180 countries. And for black expats, especially those leaving the United States, that kind of mobility changes everything. Here's why it matters. A US passport is still strong, but it comes with baggage. Extra screenings, extra questions, extra random checks that never seem random. A black American who became a permanent resident in Australia said on a travel forum, "The way I get treated at airports changed. I stopped feeling like I had something to prove." That difference alone makes travel less stressful and more human. Australia also sits in one of the most powerful locations on the planet, right next to Asia and the Pacific. From Sydney or Melbourne, you're a short flight away from Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and New Zealand. That means business, travel, and opportunity are no longer locked behind 20-hour flights and visa nightmares. A black tech consultant based in Brisbane put it like this: "I can do a week in Tokyo, 2 weeks in Singapore, and be back home without burning a month of my life." That's what global living actually looks like. Then there's the professional side. Australia is deeply plugged into Asia-Pacific trade networks. Companies here do business with China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands every day. For black professionals, that opens doors to international contracts, overseas assignments, and cross-border income streams that are much harder to access from the US or even Europe. One black finance worker in Sydney said, "I used to feel boxed in by one economy. Now I'm plugged into 3. That kind of exposure builds wealth, not just paychecks. And there's a psychological shift too. When you live somewhere that's globally connected, you stop thinking in survival mode and start thinking in options. You can work in Australia, vacation in Bali, invest in Singapore, and retire in New Zealand. That's not fantasy. That's geography doing the heavy lifting. For black people who grew up feeling trapped by borders, visas, and systems that were never designed to favor them, Australia offers something rare: mobility with leverage. And in today's world, freedom isn't just about where you live, it's about how easily you can leave. Now let's jump into the biggest cons of living in Australia as a black person. Number 1. Australia has a quiet race problem. Racism in Australia doesn't usually come wearing a hood or screaming in your face. It comes wearing a smile, holding a clipboard, and politely asking a few extra questions, just for you. That's what makes it tricky. It's not the kind you can easily point to and say, "There it is." It's the kind that shows up in patterns. Black expats in Australia often describe the same routine: being followed a little too closely in stores, getting their bags checked when no one else's are, or hearing their accent suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. A black American living in Sydney wrote on a forum, "People treat me like I'm interesting until it's time to trust me." That's the quiet part. In the workplace, the subtlety gets sharper. You're qualified, you're hired, and yet somehow you're always asked to explain yourself just a bit more. A Kenyan-born IT worker said, "I do the same job as everyone else, but I'm the only one who has to keep proving I belong." That extra burden isn't written into any contract. but it's felt every day. Housing is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Multiple studies and real estate audits in Australia have found that people with African or Indigenous-sounding names receive fewer rental callbacks than applicants with Anglo-sounding names, even when their qualifications are the same. A black woman in Perth shared, "When my white friend called about the apartment, it was available. When I called back, suddenly it was taken." That's not coincidence, that's pattern. And let's not forget the police. While Australia doesn't have the same level of violent encounters as the US, Black and Indigenous people are still stopped, questioned, and searched at higher rates than white Australians. A Black British man living in Melbourne said, "I don't fear for my life, but I do feel like I'm always being sized up." This is what people mean when they talk about Australia's racism experience. It's not always explosive, it's exhausting. It makes you second-guess yourself. It makes you wonder if you're being judged for what you did or for what you look like. So when someone asks, "Is Australia racist?" the honest answer is, not in a way that makes the evening news, but in a way that quietly shapes who gets believed, who gets chosen, and who gets the benefit of the doubt. And that kind of racism can be just as powerful, because it hides in plain sight. Number 2, blackness equals foreignness. One of the strangest things Black people notice in Australia is this invisible rule that no one ever writes down. If you're Black, you must be from somewhere else. It doesn't matter if you were born in Sydney, raised in Brisbane, or went to school in Melbourne. Many people will still look at you like you just stepped off a plane. Black Australians joke about it, but it's the kind of joke that comes from exhaustion. A Ghanaian Australian comedian once said on stage, "I've lived here my whole life, but somehow I'm still new. I'm more Australian than half the people asking me where I'm from." That one line sums up a daily reality. The questions are usually delivered politely, which makes them harder to push back on. So, where are you really from? How did you get here? Your English is so good. None of these sound hostile, but they all send the same message. You don't belong here. For Black immigrants in Australia, it can feel even heavier. A Nigerian-born woman in Adelaide shared online, "People keep asking me when I'm going back. I just got here to build a life, not to visit." That constant reminder that you're seen as temporary, no matter how stable your life becomes, wears you down. What makes this more complicated is that Australia was built on immigration. Most Australians can trace their roots to somewhere else: Britain, Italy, Greece, China, India. Yet somehow, whiteness gets to be native, while Blackness gets treated like an exception. A Black Australian journalist wrote, "We are always asked to explain our presence in our own country." Psychologists call this perpetual foreigner syndrome, when someone is treated as an outsider no matter how long they've been part of a society. Studies show it increases stress, lowers feelings of belonging, and contributes to anxiety and depression among racial minorities. In other words, this isn't just annoying, it's harmful. And it shows up in small moments. Being asked to prove your visa status, being told your name is hard, or being treated like you represent an entire continent. Over time, those moments pile up. So while Australia may welcome Black people on paper, in practice many are made to feel like guests in their own lives. And when you're always being reminded that you're other, the real cost isn't money, it's belonging. Number 3, Indigenous history shapes race dynamics. To really understand race in Australia, you have to start with the part of the story most people don't like to talk about. The part that happened long before Black expats ever booked a flight. Australia wasn't just settled, it was taken. Indigenous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples lived on this land for over 60,000 years before British colonization, and what followed included land theft, forced labor, cultural destruction, and policies designed to erase entire communities. Australia didn't operate plantation slavery like the United States, but it did use Indigenous people as unpaid or underpaid labor for decades, especially on cattle stations and farms. Children were removed from their families in what became known as the Stolen Generations, a government policy that lasted into the 1970s. An Aboriginal elder once said, "They didn't need chains, the law was the chain." That history isn't buried, it's unfinished. Indigenous Australians today still face dramatically higher rates of poverty, incarceration, and health problems than white Australians. When a society never fully confronts how it was built, those inequalities quietly become normal. And that shapes how race is handled across the board. A Black American living in Darwin shared, "You can feel the tension. It's not always about you, but you're walking inside a system that already learned how to ignore Black pain." That's the part many newcomers don't expect. Australia talks a lot about being multicultural, but it has never fully had its national reckoning about what was taken, who was harmed, and how that legacy still operates. A prominent Indigenous activist once said, "They want reconciliation without responsibility." That avoidance creates a culture where race is uncomfortable, often avoided, and rarely dealt with honestly. So when Black immigrants in Australia experience subtle exclusion, extra scrutiny, or quiet bias, it's not random. It's happening inside a society that never healed its original racial wound. That wound didn't disappear, it just learned to be polite. This is why the question, "Is Australia racist?" is complicated but very real. You may not encounter open hostility every day, but you are living in a system shaped by unresolved trauma, and this historical erasure, and a long tradition of deciding who truly belongs. And when a country hasn't fully faced its past, it often struggles to fully welcome the future, especially when that future is Black. Number 4. Dating and social life can be harder. Here's where the glossy, multicultural paradise image of Australia really starts to crack. Dating and social life. Because being Black in Australia doesn't just shape how you're treated at work, it follows you straight into bars, dating apps, and social spaces. And for many Black expats, the experience swings wildly between two extremes, invisible or exotic, rarely just human. On one end, you get ignored. A Black woman living in Melbourne wrote in an expat forum, "On dating apps, I can swipe for days and get nothing. Then I change my location to New York and suddenly I'm popular." That's not about personality. That's about how Blackness is ranked in local beauty standards. Australia, like many Western countries, inherited Eurocentric ideals that quietly push darker skin and African features to the margins. On the other end, you get fetishized. A Jamaican Australian man said in a podcast interview, "Some people don't want to date me. They want to experience me." That means comments about your body, your exotic look, or assumptions about your sexuality, things that make you feel more like a curiosity than a partner. And it's not just dating. Social circles can be hard to break into. Australians tend to form tight friend groups early in life, and newcomers, especially Black ones, often feel stuck on the outside. A Kenyan-born woman in Sydney shared, "Everyone is polite, but nobody invites you over." That quiet distance can feel colder than open rejection. The data backs this up in subtle ways. Studies on social integration in Australia show migrants from African and Caribbean backgrounds report higher levels of loneliness and lower levels of social belonging than most other immigrant groups. That doesn't mean people are cruel. It means the system wasn't built with you in mind. So you start noticing patterns. Being asked where you're really from. Being told you speak so well. Being treated like you represent an entire continent. Over time, that wears on you. Yet some Black expats still find love, community, and deep friendships. But they'll tell you it took longer and more emotional labor than expected. As one Black Australian put it, "You have to work twice as hard just to be seen." In a country that prides itself on being laid back and friendly, that's a strange contradiction. Because when you're always either overlooked or put on display, it becomes hard to feel like you truly belong. Number 5, you'll always be other. This is the part nobody puts in the relocation brochures. You can live in Australia for 5 years, 10 years, raise kids there, buy a house, pay taxes, learn the slang, and still hear the same question. So where are you from? Not where you live, where you're from. That small wording carries a heavy message. You're not really one of us. Many Black people in Australia quietly share the same feeling. I never fully felt Australian. A Black British man who's lived in Sydney for over a decade said in an interview, "I have permanent residency, a career, and Australian friends, but I'm still treated like a guest." That constant sense of being on the outside doesn't scream at you, it whispers every day. It shows up in careers. Studies on workplace diversity in Australia consistently show that people of African descent are underrepresented in leadership and management roles, even when they have equal or higher qualifications. A black professional in Melbourne explained it this way: "I get hired, I get praised, I just don't get promoted. That glass ceiling may not have a sign on it, but it's there." Housing isn't immune either. Black renters and buyers often report feeling scrutinized, questioned, or quietly passed over. A Somali Australian woman said, "I had the income, the references, everything, but somehow the house always went to someone else." Over time, you start noticing the pattern. Social belonging might be the hardest hit. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Australians are friendly, but friendships often stay surface level. A black American living in Brisbane put it bluntly, "Everyone is nice, nobody is close." That distance can slowly chip away at your mental health, especially when you're far from home. Psychologists link this kind of perpetual outsider feeling to higher levels of anxiety, stress, and burnout among migrants. When you're always adapting, explaining, or shrinking parts of yourself, it takes a toll, even if everything else in your life looks good on paper. Australia can offer safety, opportunity, and stability, but for many black people, full belonging remains just out of reach. And sometimes the hardest part of living in a beautiful place isn't the cost. It's the feeling that you're still just visiting, even after you've unpacked. Australia can be a land of opportunity for black people, but it can also be emotionally expensive. So the real question isn't, is Australia good? It's, is Australia good for you? Would you trade the loud, in-your-face racism many people experience in America for the quieter, more subtle version some black expats describe in Australia? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more real, data-driven conversations about where black people can live, thrive, and move smarter around the world, make sure you watch the other videos right here on Virtual Travel by Brian, and stay locked in.